it'll destroy the value of existing infrastructure, which I think Director Satomori addressed in his very final remarks, which was we need to emphasize the use of existing infrastructure rather than the idea of building entirely new infrastructure. But really to achieve rapid decarbonization, you probably need to do a lot of things at once. Those would be actively developing new technologies, expanding production of renewable power and renewable fuels in all forms, while also aggressively implementing oil and gas investments that reduce emissions and lower carbon intensity of all products right now, to eliminate waste in the industry, the energy industry, and in the plastic space. To emphasize that last point, the EIA has said that end-use consumption of energy in the United States is 80% fuels and 20% power. So even if we have a rapid expansion of electrification, another one of our themes on these panels today, even if it doubles, grows at 50% over a short period of time, you're still looking at trying to cut consumption of fuels, which means you need more and different fuels. You need to decarbonize the fuels we have, and you need to increase the amount of sustainably sourced fuels. So this is an interesting point because it's where circularity, one of our topics, sustainably sourced raw materials, hydrogen, and carbon capture all meet, which is why I'm delighted to be with this panel today. So with that, I will move on to our wonderful speakers, and Jeremy, you can come speak here or speak from your chair, whichever you like.
Thank you, Jason, for the introduction, and thank you, Baker Institute and Baker Botts for hosting this conference. My name is Jeremy Baines, and I'm the regional president for Neste US. If we can go to the next slide, please. And I'd like to talk to you about Neste and what we are doing. Neste has been in the business of fighting climate change for a while. Our company was founded about 73 years ago, and really over the last 15 years, we have been transforming ourselves to a renewable company, moving away from fossil fuels. And today, we are the largest producer of renewable fuels, renewable diesel, sustainable aviation fuel in the world, and looking to expand that into other areas like renewable plastics and renewable chemicals. Next slide, please. Jason, you talked about the roles for decarbonizing, and we saw the discussions from the IEA. The energy transformation that we need to do to get to net zero by 2050 is enormous, and we need to start today. There's no option to wait for some perfect solution to come along. On top of that, we saw from the IEA that on the road to 2030, 50% of the initiatives are still in the lab. Again, a reminder that we need to move fast. Today in the United States, you have 11 million Class 8 heavy-duty trucks on the road. Just in August alone, another 15,000 went onto the road. These vehicles will be on the road for the next 10, 15 years, burning fuel. So they can either burn fossil fuel or they can burn a renewable fuel and start reducing emissions overnight. The aviation space is growing by 2 to 3% per year. And we recently saw an announcement that Boeing is planning on selling 8,700 jets to China by 2040. These jets will be in service for the next 20 to 30 years, again burning liquid fuels. The choice is clear. Do we burn petroleum fuels or do we burn a more sustainable fuel? And if we look at plastics and chemicals, it's a huge amount of single-use plastics everywhere in our life today. Neste is working on the technology to collect those plastics, recycle them, and then to be able to chemically reuse them. And this brings me to the next slide, which is about circular economy. And this is circular economy on a micro scale, if you want. This is how we as a company collect used cooking oils from restaurants across the United States, today from over 45,000 restaurants. We pre-treat it, we put it through our technology process to convert it into renewable fuel, which then can power those cities again. On a micro level, we've been doing this, for example, with the city of Oakland, where we collect the used cooking oil from the municipality, convert it into fuel, and now the municipality runs all of their municipal vehicles on renewable diesel. One of the main questions behind this is the number one. Where does this all come from? And that's on the next slide when we talk about feedstock. Neste is able to use over 10 different feedstocks. If we could have the next slide, please. There we go. Neste is today able to use over 10 different raw materials. And just in the first half of this year, 92% of all the feedstocks that we used were either waste and residue. And we continue to look at other waste and residues that are available out there. We are exploring cover crops. We're looking at algae for the technology that we are running today. But then we're looking beyond that. Municipal solid waste, forestry waste, lignocellulosic, but then also renewable power to either energy sources like e-fuels or to hydrogen, because all of this will be required to be able to rapidly decarbonize transportation, especially in the hard-to-abate sectors. If we think about then, I talked about circular economy on a micro level, but on a macro level, what does it look like? The fuels that we produce today emit no new greenhouse gases, because all of the CO2, all of the carbon in those fuels was previously in the atmosphere. So it's forming a really large loop, a circular loop. From the carbon that's in the atmosphere, we collect, it goes into the oils, it goes into greases, and that is then what is then burnt in the atmosphere. Why is it not 100%? Because today we still have to put the energy into making those fuels. That energy is not net zero yet. That's why Neste is committed to net zero production by 2035, so we take away the emissions from that side. And then working with partners, we're looking to make the transportation of those fuels back to the market more efficient so that we can get to a net zero solution. And this is achievable, and this is scalable. And then the last part of that we were discussing very briefly was about plastics and chemicals. So Neste has got these two different circular solutions to it. On the one hand, we can use the renewable feedstocks to make the chemicals that then go into that process, but we are also working on the chemical recycling of plastics. So once those plastics have been collected, post-consumer plastics, we chemically recycle them and are able to put them back into the chain as virgin plastics. So you can imagine the circular future where all the carbon in the atmosphere ends up in fuels or ends up in plastics. The plastics are reused and there's no need to put additional carbon into the atmosphere. None of this is possible without partnerships. Neste cannot do any of this alone. This is far too complex. So Neste is continuously working with partners. I mentioned the City of Oakland, who have been really at the forefront of this micro-circular solution, but we're also working with companies like McDonald's that collect a lot of used cooking oil and require the food to be delivered to their restaurants. So today I look forward to participating in this panel discussion, especially about circularity and renewable fuels. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Rich?
So good morning, everybody. And thank you, Jason. I'd like to thank Baker Botts and the Baker Institute for inviting us here. I'd like to kind of start my remarks carrying on from the last thing that Jeremy said, which is really about working together, because it's about collaboration. And I'll answer a couple of questions. One is, who are ports and what can ports do in this broader equation of decarbonization, circularity, and then the broader scope of sustainability. We don't own the ships or the trucks or the plants along the ship channels, but we can play a role in a few words, facilitating, collaborating, and accelerating the energy transition. And I'll talk a little bit more about that now. Which button do I press? This one?
Middle one.
Yes. Okay.
Big one.
So who we are. In Houston, the port is a very complex ecosystem. There's the public authority, which I represent, and then there are 200 private facilities, Exxon, Shell, Targa, Enterprise Products, different kinds of companies that are engaged in the energy and the petrochemicals industry as well. And then the Port Authority has the container terminals. We have 3 million TEUs of cargo that is coming in, and as everybody knows, is surging right now in most ports around the country. And those are served by about 6,000 trucks per day. And if you lined up those 6,000 trucks, it's 90 miles of trucks. And so we have to get them in and out of the terminals very quickly. And that alone is a little bit about decarbonization, because if they're waiting for 5 minutes to get in, that's 5 minutes of idling. We've brought the time down from over 10 minutes 20 years ago to under 60 seconds today. So that's us. The private facilities are tremendous installed infrastructure investment, 500 million barrels of storage for various products, 1,200 pipelines, and I can't tell you the number of miles of pipelines. That's a really important piece when we think about the hydrogen economy and energy transition. And then together, the port complex in Houston is 3 million jobs nationwide. It's $800 billion of economic value. It's 10,000 ships. That's bigger than the next 3 busiest ports combined. And it's the biggest port in the country in terms of total tonnage. So there's a lot going on in Houston. Let me pull it back a second and say, what are we doing about decarbonization and circularity, and then I'll expand it back out to this ecosystem. So what the port is doing is we can control inside our fence lines. In the last 4 years, we've reduced our carbon footprint by 55% by a few big movers. One was a major electricity contract, working with a subsidiary of Shell to move to 100% renewable electricity. We've been continuously upgrading our cargo handling equipment to hybrid electric, which reduces the emissions, the NOx and the carbon by 70 to 90%. And then we've replaced literally every light bulb that we own at the cost of several $1 million, which reduces the electricity consumption by 75%, so therefore the emissions. And in the last 6 years, we just got some data hot off the press in terms of those upgrades to equipment and what they're doing in terms of pollutants and emissions. And carbon is part of that, NOx and SOx are part of that, and they're all down between 15 and 93% over the last 6 years. And then in terms of circularity, we have a recycling program. It's overwhelmingly weighted by concrete recycling, but there are 8,000 tons of oil, plastic, e-waste, paper, and so we do what we can inside of our fence. Now, let me talk about outside of our fence. The port is a really big area. We have a 52-mile long ship channel. We have, as I said, 200 private facilities, but we also have communities, and they work and live in the neighborhoods, in the shadow of the refining and petrochemical plants, in the shadow of our terminals, and they have concerns as well, and there's no shortage of concerns. The map is fairly busy, but it's not just decarbonization. It's all about jobs, it's about habitat restoration, it's about sustainability in general. And we've listened to our stakeholders, and they ask us, great, you're doing some things, but can you do even more? And so this summer we did a workshop, a series of workshops, and we engaged 80 participants. I think we invited 140, 150 from industry. Rachel participated in our workshops, so the institutions as well as the communities and the environmental advocates. And you can see in the word cloud what they said to us was important. It's about emissions reduction, decarbonization, clean air. It's also about habitat. It's about environmental justice, clean water, and so forth. So we asked the question, what else can we do? What's important to our stakeholders? And what's the role of a port in this equation? And so, long story short, we had 3 rounds of workshops. We peeled the onion back progressively to get more detail, and we asked some questions. And what's important to the stakeholders was that sooner, closer is more important than solving world global issues. But world global issues are still important because they're strategic and long-term and impactful. Collaboration, Jeremy's introduced theme, is really important because nobody can do these things alone. We are a village, an ecosystem per se. And then we have to be aligned with the region's climate action plans and so forth. We came up with 27 opportunities to lead, partner, or support, and those are the roles of the port around different sustainability initiatives. around those priority areas you can see on the screen. So clean tech, air quality, circular economy, community was very important, as well as transparency. I'll just highlight a few of these 27 initiatives. On the top half, people, diversity, equity, and inclusion, these types of things are very important, but since the topic is around decarbonization and circularity, the ideas on the top were, what we can lead is continuing to improve the equipment we use inside of our fence line. We can also work directly with TxDOT and the Houston Galveston Area Council around transportation planning to make sure that the road and rail networks are as efficient as possible, because when you eliminate idling and you eliminate slow traffic, that goes to the theme of efficiency, which is our first tool in decarbonization. And then partnering, we have a lot of conversations going on with different companies and startups right now around some of these initiatives. Alternative fuels for trucks, whether it's hydrogen, whether it's methanol, whether it's CNG, LNG, whether it's electricity, and the same for harbor vessels and ocean-going vessels, whether that is methanol as a fuel or ammonia as a fuel, and how can we participate in either making those kinds of bunkering and fueling facilities more convenient to, say, those 6,000 trucks that come through. Dockside emissions, actually doing shore power or putting a scrubber on top of the stack of a ship. We're in conversations with companies that want to do that as well. Plastics pyrolysis, a couple of the chemical companies are focused on, Houston is the leading exporter of plastic resins in the country. If those plastic resins could come back in some form and get recycled, then it's a big win for the petrochemical complex to have its own recycling facility right here. And there's other conversations around recycling to produce net zero methanol and other types of conversations like that. And then from a support standpoint, we do want to draw the circle as big as possible to address global issues. So we have been a founding member of the Blue Sky Maritime Coalition. The International Energy Agency created in July also an International Hydrogen Ports Coalition, which was also launched. We're working with clean tech incubators, ION, right down the street, and Greentown Labs. And then we're also working with state agencies to put air monitors in the local communities so that we can get back to measuring some of this, this emission levels to benefit strategies around mitigating those things for the communities. So I'll close with just one picture. This is the Blue Sky Maritime Coalition. It's a collection of very impactful companies. It's not just the people who own the vessels. It's got financial interests, it's got ports, and as I said, we launched this just a while ago, and we are focused on 4 areas of investigation, which are at the bottom of the slide. Measuring, you can't manage what you don't measure. Finance and commercial chartering. Can we get collaboration around with the engine manufacturers and the vessel owners to go to alternative fuels? I'll note, I think it was yesterday, Maersk, who is one of the biggest users of the port here in terms of the container liner trade, announced they are going to order 8 methanol driven vessels, big ships. And so that's a recognition of the transition to alternative fuels. And the last thought I'll say is we're not, as a port, not going to pick winners and losers. It goes back to those words I said before. It's about acceleration, it's about facilitation and collaboration, and the connections that we can make, because a port is at the nexus of thousands of supply chains. We get to see a lot of things, and we can connect dots and help accelerate the transition to energy, new energy. With that, I'll just close and move on.
Rich, I think I love how granular your focus has been, how you've gone straight to the community. Like what's important to the people who live and work around this port, and just straight to solutions. And there's a ton of overlap, with what the solutions Jeremy was talking about. But just a fantastic overview. Thank you so much. Heath?
Great, thank you. First, on behalf of Phillips 66, I want to thank you for the opportunity to participate in this critical summit. It really couldn't be more timely for us to address this. I'm not sure if I'm concerned or excited that we're so well aligned here, right? I think we're in violent agreement on a lot of these things. I'm going to try to echo some of that, but also build on top of it, right? At Phillips, we understand the dual challenge of providing rateable, reliable, affordable energy while addressing our climate challenges, right? There is no clear correlation to economic poverty than energy poverty, right? So how do we do this without disrupting everything else and extending how we get energy to people, right? Now this is my cover slide, typically you flip past it pretty quick, but I want to kind of highlight some of the icons on there, right? A lot of these you actually probably saw similar to the ones on your little green panel you had at the beginning. We have to think broadly here. And I like the comments before about, don't pick winners, be technology neutral. If the issue is about having less CO2 in the air, incent that specifically, right? Let's not go ahead and decide we want these people to win or those to lose. If you think about the traditional oil and gas industry, right? We handle large volumes, right? We supply a lot of energy. We're good at building things. We're good at operating things. That's where you're going to find the big solutions to move things fast. The people that are good at this already. We handle molecules and electrons today. We can handle molecules and electrons differently going forward, maybe different molecules. And that's okay too. So there's a lot going on here. I want to share where we're going on our journey at Phillips 66. Right, we talk about providing energy, improving lives. It's not providing hydrocarbons necessarily, right? But it's really focused on improving the world we live in. And that's how we approach our challenges and keep that front and center. And how do we make sure that we're going to be around a long time to do that? Okay, so I'm sure my friends lawyer friends at Baker Botts will appreciate this panel. At least I hope so, because my lawyer friends at Phillips insist I include it. So I'll be saying some things that are forward-looking. There's no guarantee of future performance. Let's get past that. Okay, so sustainability, right? And this is really long-term resiliency. That's what we're talking about. How do we have a resilient economy, right? Resilient communities. We talk about ESG, and you'll see all those things on here, right? It's beyond that, though, right? It's about operating excellence. If you can't operate these assets well, you're not going to be around. All right? We certainly understand the environmental side of it, the stewardship. That includes the social piece that comes with that, with environmental justice. Right? You have to be able to govern the business well, so we think about that closely. We have a very diversified board that's focused on this energy transition, making sure we're thinking broadly about it and how do we approach that. But it's also financial performance. We have to keep that in mind as well. We talked before about how are we going to pay for all this stuff, right? And when you see prices doing what they're doing today in Europe on natural gas, that's a concern. That'll disrupt the transition, right? So we have to do what we can now. Don't mess up what we're doing now. And find other ways to provide energy. And there's ways we can do it. And we can provide our traditional energy, but do it better, right? We can talk about, and I'll talk at the end kind of about a future we see even as we continue to consume crude oil for decades. All right, that's simply, it's a reality. But you don't have to live with the historical reality of how we've done it. And we can think about how do we do that better. And I think that's critically important. So as we've been going on our journey at Phillips 66, and I led our corporate strategy group the last few years, and we've been thinking about all these things we've been doing. For decades, we've been the primary supplier of specialty needle coke into the steel industry. It goes into electric arc furnace technology. Uses recycled steel, and uses used steel to recycle it to make brand new steel. That's the alternative to using a blast furnace, right? Use iron ore, high carbon intensity. If you do it through an electric arc furnace, it's about 1/10 the CO2 impact, right? We've been doing that for decades. That's a circular economy. Let's do more of that. Let's replace more of those blast furnaces. We've been processing used cooking oil at our Humber refinery, using the existing refining asset. Low to no capital. Do it today. Don't have to go build something huge, wait 3 years for a permit. We're also doing trial runs of taking pyrolysis oil, tire pyrolysis oil, recycled tires, and doing the same thing. We've converted one of our units at the Rodeo refinery to run all renewable feedstocks, right? So we think about those things. We were doing these things already. So how do you go ahead and make it more momentum, right? And really put some horsepower behind it, focus on it. So we decided to stand up a new group called Emerging Energy. Right? We have refining, we have chemicals, we have marketing, commercial organizations, specialties. We're going to have an emerging energy organization that's going to be on scale with those by the end of the decade. And we're committing the capital to it. So we decided last year to stand this group up. And we really pushed for that in the annual strategy meeting with our executives and the board. And then later that month, I became the latest example of, if you complain about it long enough, you get put in charge of it. So here I am. I went out and grabbed a number of people from across the company. We're building the team out. And we looked broadly. We looked across a lot of technologies. If you think about the country or the globe needs to put $3 to $5 trillion a year in by the end of the decade for this transition, you need a lot of players. All right, so the question is, where's the best place for Phillips 66 to participate? And how do we make a meaningful difference to improving lives? So we looked hard and wide, and we knew the world was running fast, and they weren't going to wait for us to figure out our strategy. So we kind of ran parallel paths. We looked at a lot of different technologies, things we could do, things we were good at. We actually have a energy research and innovation facility up in Bartlesville, Oklahoma. It's been there for decades, looking at all kinds of technologies, battery technology, carbon capture, renewables, energy efficiency, and so we're going to leverage some of that. And that's something that's kind of unique to Phillips 66. You don't see that in a lot of our peers at that scale that we do. So we looked at all kinds of things. We looked at some crazy ideas, right? And our phone rang off the hook as soon as we announced we were doing this. Everyone had a great idea, they just needed money. Right? And one person was insistent they could find ways to harness the electromagnetic fields of the Earth to generate actual renewable power. That's a good idea for somebody else to fund. So we're looking at a lot of different things. We talked to a lot of people, and we talked to a lot of consultants. We talked to a lot of the banks. We talked to a lot of our peers. And we heard a lot of people say, well, that's really not feasible. You know, hydrogen's, that's 2030 plus. You can't really do hydrogen today, not in a financially responsible way. We see people doing it. Right? We think of the old mantra of the person who says it's impossible should interrupt the person who's doing it. And so we went out to talk to the people who were doing these things, right? And then we figured out, okay, for us, these are the places that we can play at scale, right? It's renewable fuels. Drop in today. Use your existing assets, right? We're looking at converting the Rodeo refinery completely, and I'll talk about that here in a minute as well, to be one of the largest, if not the largest, renewable diesel facility in the world. Using the existing asset, you get to market a lot faster, right? Batteries, it's got to be a solution. Wind and solar, right? Wind doesn't always blow, sun doesn't always shine. You got to find a way to deal with that, and you can do that today. And we have an investment opportunity we've already made there here, just even in the first 9 months. Carbon capture, you can't decarbonize everything, right? And so how do you find ways to take carbon back out? And then finally, hydrogen, right? That was actually my hydrogen question that I gave earlier, because it's a challenge, right? And you have the whole rainbow of colors, and which one's going to work, and how's it going to figure that out? So we're going to move forward with this. We've actually already made a couple of big investments, and I'll kind of get to those here. I'll cover a couple of these things. You know, we have an MOU with Southwest. We heard earlier about the challenges in the aviation industry, right? People are trying to electrify planes. That's going to take a long time, right? So how do you figure that out? And right now, it's difficult. Even the sustainable aviation fuel that's made today, it can't be blended more than 50-50 with traditional fossil jet. How do you get to 100%? You know, hydrogen, that's actually moving now. We're learning a lot, right? We talk about, you know, how do we extend our value chains today, right? That's kind of the drop-in stuff and what you're doing. How do you accelerate your learning? And that's kind of go participate at small scale so you can really figure it out, and then establish scale. So we have a few hydrogen fueling stations in Europe, and we're learning. And we're looking at establishing scale there soon. I do want to highlight the Novonix one. It's an investment we made earlier this year. It's a new company that's domiciling here in the US soon. They're an Australian company. They've been around for a while. They're entering into a new business, trying to make battery anodes for lithium-ion batteries. And it'll be the first large, it's an early mover at scale anode production facility in the US. And, you know, localized supply chains. Today, 95% of anodes for those batteries for EVs are made in Asia, most of them in China. People in Europe and people in the US, they want that production local. Right? So we take that same specialty coke that can go into the steel industry. We've been selling that into the same industry into the battery industry for the last few years. And they have found that our specialty graphite coke, or needle coke, works better than almost anything else they have. So we invested into this company, and we're going to kind of grow that business out. We're talking to a lot of the auto manufacturers to figure out how do we partner together to close. They're trying to get backwards down that value chain to understand their battery supply. We're trying to go forward up the battery chain to extend our presence, and can you meet in the middle somewhere? And that kind of gets back to what you've heard a lot of this morning, partners. You can't do a lot of this alone. Pick the right partners, right, and be thoughtful about that. So this is kind of the renewable fuels. I want to dig into that one a little bit deeper here. We talk about the Rodeo refinery, that's out in San Francisco. The Humber one I mentioned earlier, that's in the UK. Bryce, we're supporting that from a commercial aspect, a new startup, brand new. But I kind of want to talk about, that's a picture of our Rodeo refinery. So we have a vision for that refinery that goes beyond just converting it to 100% renewable fuels. And by the way, with the feed pretreatment system, anything in the world that can be turned into diesel or jet will be able to run. That's important, that feedstock flexibility, because you don't know where it's going to come from, right? Plastics as well, right? Recycling plastics, we'll be looking at that. But imagine this running 100% second generation, I mean like tallow and cooking oil fuels. We'll bring in renewable natural gas to fire the heaters and to feed the hydrogen plants to make renewable hydrogen, right? We'll capture the carbon off of it, right? We're putting in solar to help power it, right? You may end up with a 50,000 barrel a day liquid. That's 800 million gallons. People in the renewables, I talk about gallons per year. So 800 million gallons a year of essentially zero CI liquid fuel, right? In fact, it can go negative, right? We'll bring in biogas waste. We'll bring in dairy farm RNG. And so that's where you think about the dual challenge of do what you do now, but do it better. Understand that the world needs liquid hydrocarbons because the energy density is important, but also work on the other solutions. And then as better things come along, better technologies come along, be prepared to pivot. So I'll stop there, but I really appreciate the opportunity to participate.
Well, thank you so much. I think the phone rings off the hook for you because you guys are such a huge scale, and the opportunities that are available there to really decarbonize are immense. It's very interesting. Next speaker, Tak.
All right, thank you very much for having me here. I'd appreciate the hospitality extended by the Baker Institute and Baker Botts. I think this has to be my first live panel. So I was really careful that I put on my tie, look good, put on a pressed shirt. But I didn't think about the socks. Jeremy, you beat us all with the socks. But anyway, I want to kind of tell you what Mitsubishi Heavy Industries is all about. We were founded 150 years ago to be part of the Japanese Industrial Revolution. When Japan modernized, it came suddenly from a feudal lord system into a modern world. And unlike other countries where industrial revolution started with the textile industry, for example, our industrial revolution started with how to arm ourselves, because the European superpowers and America wanted to colonize Japan as well, like it did the Southeast Asian countries. So one of the goals of the new government that took over was to create Mitsubishi and have them import all the necessary technology from overseas, because we didn't have anything. Japan had been blocked to overseas trade for 270 years before it opened its doors. So what we did was we started off by producing every industrial product that Japan ever had made. But it all started with coal, harnessing the steam power to generate power, to furnace, to produce ships, naval equipment, anything that we needed to modernize our nation. So of the 40 billion in annual sales right now, internal combustion is the key technology of Mitsubishi, whether it be coal-fired, gas-fired, turbochargers, maritime engines, even our rockets. It uses grey hydrogen to fuel our rockets that send supplies to the International Space Station. So we have been a company that has made all sorts of internal combustion equipment that all emit CO2. So we know what emits CO2, but we also know how to prevent it or how to manage it. So this is what we are doing. When we look at the carbon neutral future, what we think we need to do is help decarbonize existing infrastructure, then build a hydrogen solution ecosystem, but also build a CO2 solutions ecosystem. Because when you think about decarbonization, it's really about how to remove CO2 or how to utilize CO2, then provide an alternative fuel in hydrogen, creating also a hydrogen-enabled equipment. So that's exactly what we're doing here. This is a boring slide, so I'll just put. So when we think about CO2 solutions, we have about 70% market share of post-combustion CO2 carbon capture removal technology. And we built the world's largest one here in Texas. Unfortunately, it's shut down because it was connected to enhanced oil recovery system. And when oil prices really went down, they had to shutter it because it didn't make sense to keep it running because of the operating costs. But we're also looking at more modular carbon capture systems. We're also designing and building a CO2 carrier. We're also looking at CO2 as feedstock combined with hydrogen to provide synthetic fuel as well too. This is something that we're really excited about. But one of the things that we have embarked, and I'll also go deeper into the hydrogen solution, is that right now, gray hydrogen, that's what everybody is doing right now. Then people will go into blue hydrogen. But one of the things that we're looking at is we don't want to create stranded assets of the existing infrastructure. Producing green hydrogen, you need a lot of cheap power. Not all places have that. But on the other hand, places like Japan and Korea, who are responsible for maybe 35% of all the LNG imported, we have a pretty vast network of LNG facilities and infrastructure. So we're looking at technologies that use natural gas and combine that with methane pyrolysis technology that would produce turquoise hydrogen and CO2-free carbon black. Those technologies that we're also working with partners. We're also developing technology where you can burn 100% hydrogen in a conventional gas-fired plant. Because the US may have alternative solutions, but Japan, when we think about our country, all of the energy is imported. We don't have the land mass to host acres and acres of solar panels or the land mass to host wind towers. And we don't have a continental shelf like the US, where all the continental shelf on the East Coast, BOEM saying that it's enough to supply all the power that the US needs 2 times over. We don't have a continental shelf. That's why our fishing is too good. That's why our waters are deep. But one of the things that I want to emphasize today is that decarbonization is really hard tech. It's not like developing an app and spreading it to 1 million people the next day. It really is deep dive research, design, and a lot of a thought process, and to make it also economical. One solution does not fit all for every region. It really doesn't. And that is why we're looking at various alternatives. And I don't think we know what the winner is. I think somebody said, don't pick the winners yet. We don't know, I think, what the winners are. So that's why we're really spreading out, not only on our R&D, but we are working with startups here in this country. And the excitement in the startup industry right now in America, it's probably never been like this. But what the US is pretty good about doing is, and it's unparalleled when compared to what the other countries are able to do, it's a magnet for talent and bridging that talent with the capital markets. Nobody does it better than America. So that's why we are working with a lot of these startups that have great ideas, and we're working with them to help them scale, optimize, and hopefully get the processes running up. That's kind of what we're doing here. And I'll stop there.
That is fantastic. I really like the idea that decarbonization really depends on who you are and where you are, or even to go back to Jeremy's presentation, to Rich's presentation about like who the people around the port are. What do they want out of this process? It's not just a global thought of decarbonization. It's here locally. We have different needs. We have different solutions. It's fantastic. Rachel?
Well, thanks for having me on this panel. It's great to be up here discussing this topic with you all. Again, I'm Rachel Meidl. I'm a fellow here at the Baker Institute, and a lot of the work that I do is around sustainability and circular economy. And so I'm going to step way outside and way back from the things that we've been talking about and go back to the basics of what it is, because I think that this word is so overused today. The latest buzzword. That it's oftentimes misconstrued, and so I want to just kind of go back to what it is, and then tie that into circular economy, because oftentimes these two are used in conjunction with one another, but they are vastly different approaches that have different foundations and principles associated with that. And so with sustainability, when we look at this, it's really a systems level approach that looks at all of these different variables here, and it assesses how they interact. It looks at trade-offs and where risks are shifted. It looks at life cycle assessments of all these things all across the entire supply chain. And it's really about systems balance. And so oftentimes when we hear about sustainability from policymakers or the media or industries, they take a very diagnostic approach and a product-based approach or a technology-based approach, saying this thing is sustainable. Well, without actually looking at all of the different factors associated with that and the relationship between all of these things and the relationship between the larger system, things in isolation really can't be sustainable. So that's something that that we have to keep in mind when we talk about sustainability. It's really about the overall systems relationship with that. And so how does circular economy fit into all of this? And so that it's becoming, even though it's been around for many, many years, since the 1960s, and builds off of different disciplines such as industrial ecology and those things. It's been around, prior to the 1960s, probably. A lot of different countries have developed this into their national policies and strategies. And like China was one of the first countries to implement this. I think Japan was actually prior. They looked at more of it from a recycling approach. But there's a number of countries that are adopting this, and companies as well. They're integrating this into their larger sustainability strategies. But what we don't understand really in a circular economy is the sustainability of a circular process or a circular policy. And so I want to back up a minute here and just talk about some of the themes here of a circular economy. And those are things like designing for reuse and remanufacturing and disassembly, designing out waste. Is a part of that. Oftentimes we're focused on recycling. That's where the large portion of the projects these days are centered on, but it really is a systems, and it looks all across the supply chain for different efficiencies. And one of the challenges with the circular economy is that I did a quick literature review and found that there's over 100 active definitions for circular economy. So that makes it really, really difficult to understand and apply, especially as a couple of you had mentioned, it can be applied at very, very different levels. And when you look at those 100 active definitions of a circular economy, less than 10% of them really focus on a holistic view, and very little actually integrated into the larger sustainability profile. So that can be problematic when we try to concatenate these two ideas. But there are benefits associated with circular economy, as you all have touched on, but then there are rebound effects that we have to consider as well. I mean, it certainly comes with higher costs, And there's societal factors that we have to consider, and you know, I'm sure we'll talk about more about that in some of our discussions. But when we look at the basis and the fundamentals of a circular economy, it's really with the assumption that it can support infinite growth. Well, you know, we know that's not possible unless we actually start you know, looking at material intensity, reducing some of that in our consumption practices. And it also is the basis for, you know, 100% recyclability of everything. And for those of you that follow the developments in the second law of thermodynamics, you know, that is chaos and disorder in the system. It's just really not possible to have 100% recyclability. And there's some exceptions with metals and things like that, but the law of physics really doesn't allow for that. And then also just the material demand for the things that we're creating, all the different systems and low carbon technologies. There's just not enough material to meet that demand. Going back to the prior to about population growth and thermodynamics. So that is circular economy. And when we talk about how it's applied, it can be applied very, very differently, horizontally, vertically. I mean, there's more to this than what I have identified, you know, on here, but it can be applied and interpreted at the macro level, which is international, national, and state, regional, local, through those types of legislations, and it could be down to the company organizational level, where you start looking at collaboration and partnerships, and then the micro level down to, you know, the consumers and business units and to industrial processes and products. So it really depends on how you define it and where you apply it. And these are the main business models that facilitate a circular economy. I'm sure there are more, but I bucketed these into these 5 models right here. I guess what's missing in number 1, the circular supplies, is also you know, at the product design phase as well, in looking at redesign of materials. But like I said, resource recovery is the predominant business model that we're using today. Lesser used are some of the more advanced models, like product as a service, where the manufacturer maintains ownership of those things, and the sharing schemes that we have there. But these are the predominant factors of circular economy here. And what I want to mention here are some competing priorities. And when I developed this slide, it was for a plastics workshop that I was doing with CAPSARC, and so it's mainly focused on polymers, but it really is can be you know, with other materials and metals and things like that. But so if you focus on the left 2 columns is zero emission vehicles and 100% carbon-free electricity. You know, what we're not really considering here is the demand side of things, and the fact that we have materials and hydrocarbons that are going to be in higher demand in order to meet some of these larger climate targets and recycling goals. I mean, plastics are the second most commonly used materials in a vehicle, and over 50% accounts for these polymers, and it's going to be even more once we start you know, with the electric vehicles, because of the weight, to offset the weight of the lithium-ion batteries. I mean, so you have this huge demand in plastics that we're not really, you know, accounting for, and all the different materials associated with that. And there's a ton of different impacts that need to be realized and identified from land use and water competition for you know, for wind and solar. So, you know, some of the sulfur hexafluoride emissions that will increase from the use of for insulators and electrification, and we touched on social and environmental justice issues, and the fact of the matter is what we're not factoring is the waste generation process, you know, of this, and how that interacts with the larger sustainability goals, because right now there are no viable and either very few or no options for end-of-life management for a lot of these materials. And so when you start factoring in you know, the waste generation and how it's going to be managed, and the fact that these things right now are either managed in landfills or incinerated or exported to countries that don't have the capabilities and technologies to manage these things, and the impacts it has on social structures and dynamics and the environment, and in places that we're not even quantifying. You know, what does that mean for the overall sustainability agenda? So, you know, when you start integrating some of these circular processes and products, how does that interact and challenge some of our larger goals? And so, I mean, those are just some of the considerations, you know, that we have to think about. I mean, just all of the supply chain challenges. If we can't even secure a supply chain, and the challenges associated with, you know, with the mining and the processing and the transporting, and the transportation between all of those things, and the fact that we don't have end of life for all of those things. We can't secure the supply chains on the waste management side. I mean, should we really be accelerating, you know, some of these? And I'm not anti-innovation. I think we absolutely should be innovating, but shouldn't we accelerate the waste management side? Shouldn't we be accelerating, you know, end-of-life technologies with that? I mean, it just, to me, it doesn't make sense to pour in millions of dollars in subsidies to things that go directly to waste management when you have newer models and more efficient things come into the market, when we can't even manage the end-of-life aspect of it. It just seems to almost incentivize rapid obsolescence of these. And so, again, looking at things in its entirety from a systems level, which is what I do, and seeing how circularity fits into the whole sustainability agenda is really important for us to consider, as well as some of the metrics that we need to start integrating with circular strategies that are absent in today's policies and agendas. So I think that's, yep, that's the end of my slide.
Well, thank you for that. Let me kind of touch on that last point a little bit. It seems like when we talk about imperatives, you know, it depends on who's speaking and what their imperative is, you know, imperative to action. Let's do something now, today. And I think you identified, you know, a rapid sort of move towards obsolescence is like maybe a reason not to be making a switch to things today. How do you think we should balance the idea of rapid decarbonization through all available means with the idea of not ending up in a spot where we've wasted or we've created more waste or we've caused externalities that we weren't thinking about? How do you get the right balance with that?
Well, I mean, I think it, like, for me, I think, you know, and I'm looking at a lot of data of what's happening with these things and where the materials are going to come from. And I think we can't even wrap our heads around the quantities of all of these things that we're requiring for decarbonization and for the energy transition. And if we can't quantify, you know, waste generations and how we're going to manage them, how can we get closer to some of these threats? So I think it's really about, you know, getting that data. It's also about the waste management industry working with and collaborating, you know, with the energy industries and the developers of some of these technologies. There's very little transparency across supply chains and very little communication, but it's really going to come down to building partnerships, and that's what circular economy is about too. I mean, you can't have a circular system without active partnerships, and again, understanding what the logistics and the supply chains are. So and then of course we need a lot of enabling policies, you know, to make some of this happen, and policies that take a life cycle approach, not policies that you know, just target one technology or you know, one solution. We need to look at some of these technologies from a really holistic approach.
Yeah, it seems like there's a pretty large focus on, really in some spaces, sort of any solution that's not an oil and gas solution is a great solution, right? But I think you can see from this discussion that really oil and gas is such a huge player, petroleum products across the chain, and the entire, both from the production, the use, the downstream going to power and to other uses and fuels. I mean, it's impossible to even approach it without that.
Absolutely. I mean, and I think that's the challenge, is that there's just a general lack of awareness around the economics of hydrocarbons. in general, and the critical role they play in helping us meet some of these climate sustainability targets. I mean, there's just a major disconnect there that I think we have to reconcile.
Well, Jeremy, you're focused on circularity as a big part of what your company is doing, and you're rapidly implementing these ideas. Is there any real pushback from the imperative approach that it takes in what you're doing, but it doesn't exclude anything that's going on with the larger fuels market? It seems like there's sort of infinite room for growth for your fuel within the larger goals for the economy.
Yeah, Jason, I tend to agree. I mean, we've been hearing it more and more actually during this discussion. There is no single solution to tackling climate change. Petroleum fuel, fossil fuels are just used everywhere in our society, from plastics to heating to transportation to energy. So we need very many solutions to really decarbonize that. Circularity is part of it. I think it presents a very unique opportunity that all the carbon that we need is already in the atmosphere. We don't need to put more into it, so reusing that one and then creating other solutions out there. And I think also this touches maybe a bit on what Rachel is saying is we shouldn't waste too much. This country has a huge petroleum industry. How many miles of pipelines and refineries and oil terminals and all those assets? We should use them, but maybe use them differently in the future. And so I think there's this real opportunity to decarbonize the whole society while still using a lot of those assets. Yes, there will be certain elements that have to change, but that change can happen over time. The important thing, though, for me, is that we don't procrastinate. Yeah? We need to have action today. There are solutions that work today. They're not perfect, but that work today. Those should be implemented. Those should be encouraged, and there should be a clear target by what stage petroleum needs to stop being burnt, because at the end of the day, that's the root cause of climate change, is burning petroleum fuels. So at some stage, you need to stop doing it. Yeah, so as long as we have that roadmap laid out, then let industry compete to find what is the technology that delivers the result, not picking the winners and losers. Yeah, so it's an all-encompassing approach that I think we need.
Yeah, Jason, I might add to that if you let me. You think about circular economy, it's recycling assets as well, right? I think that's an excellent point. We've got over 20,000 miles of pipelines, moving molecules all over the place, right? So how do you use those better? In California, we're looking at that today. Some of the same challenges though, right? Batteries aren't easy. They require resources as well that are difficult to come by. So how do you advance that to get maybe away from some of those precious metals that are difficult to get? And recycling batteries will be a thing. Eventually you'll have enough batteries in the market. Hopefully you can get to the point where there's very minimal need to go get more minerals out of the ground, right? Recycle those as well, and that'll be important. We also see the same challenges in the lower carbon spaces as we see in traditional, and there's resources are tough. There's also a lot of the not in my backyard. Yeah. People want wind and solar, just not next to where they live, right? And so you have to address that challenge as well. So we need the right support, again, not picking winners and losers, but the right support to solve those problems. And eventually you do have to have some kind of molecule to build stuff. You can't build stuff out of sunshine and wind. And so how do you do that in the best possible way?
Well, maybe a follow-up question to that for both of you. Given the enormity of the U.S. fuels market, right, how much renewable fuel can we possibly make? I mean, is it possible to replace the enormous U.S. Fuels market with renewable fuels?
If we hoard it all for ourselves and don't share it across, yeah, you could, but it's tough. And it comes down to the feedstock. We've got to be better at aggregating the feedstock. You'll use some from crops, right? But you'll need a lot of it from more second generation. And that kind of gets back to the recycling. How do you gather that stuff? These are hydrocarbons. You can make jet fuel or diesel out of almost anything that's a hydrocarbon.
Well, right, but then doesn't that put you in competition with other sectors of the economy?
Absolutely.
People like to eat food as well as
That's
gather
right.
it for fuel.
Mm-hmm. That's right. That's why we have to find that balance. That's right.
And talk, maybe this goes to the hydrogen point you're making about e-fuels and creating fuels from pulling CO2 and combining it with hydrogen to make fuel that could be potentially much lower carbon.
Exactly. See, when you look at what's sustainable and what's economical. You really have to be very careful about this topic, but because there's so much abundance of natural gas available, both in America, Middle East, Australia, if you can really create a valuable low carbon solution using that ingredient, but also using that CO2 that comes out of your factories and combining that to make e-fuels, that is a win-win solution. Now, the reason why also we think about hydrogen is that manufacturing is responsible for about 30% of CO2 emissions. The chemical industry, the steel industry, the cement industry, these are all hard to abate industries. You talked about blast furnaces. Today, the world makes 1.9 billion tons of steel. For every ton, 2 tons of CO2 emissions. So the steel industry alone emits 4 billion tons of CO2 every year, 9% of the whole global output. But we are looking at producing steel using hydrogen as a reductant rather than coking coal or natural gas. But we're not there yet, but it's in development. So for hard to abate industries, I think hydrogen does have to be a solution. Otherwise, we just don't see a pathway toward decarbonizing industry. The power industry, I think, is a lot easier, especially in the United States. You have all this land mass to do wind, solar, offshore, and also you have all this land mass and also the seabed where you have the geological advantage to do sequestration through a carbon capture process. I think Houston just announced, including your company, that 11 of the Houston's biggest oil and gas and chemical companies all agree that they're going to work together to find a carbon capture solution and sequester that carbon in the Houston ship channel. It holds, I think, 590 billion tons of CO2, enough for 130 years of CO2 emissions of the United States. We don't have that.
Well, if we need hydrogen and we need gas to produce it, I mean, the other way to produce it is, using wind or solar or renewables, or even nuclear, as Ken was talking about earlier, kind of the forgotten, zero carbon energy source. And but in the short run, if we want to move quickly, there's nothing like something you already have, right?
Exactly.
And since hydrogen is hard to handle, it brittles things, it flies away. When you try to liquefy it, you lose about half of it. It's very difficult to deal with. You want to produce it close to where you're going to consume it. It seems like gas is like a natural path there, but it does take carbon capture, and it would extend the life of the oil and gas business. It certainly utilizes existing, pipes and existing industry. Is that combating a long-term goal of sort of getting away from hydrocarbons altogether? And is that something we should worry about? I mean, Rachel, maybe you could.
Well, I was I don't know how quickly you can integrate hydrogen. I mean, if you were to map out, all of the controlling statutes, all of the agencies, the regulations underneath all of those jurisdictions, the voluntary and industry standards associated with all of that across the entire life cycle of hydrogen, and how it's produced, in what form, how it's transported, all of those things. Whether it's going to be stored in stationary tanks, how it's going to be moved. All of those things, what would that look like? The answer is we just don't know. We really have underdeveloped, not just infrastructure, but we have underdeveloped policies and regulations of that. It's going to require new supply chains, access to new markets, a reassessment of all the existing regulations and performance standards out there for tanks and vehicles and maritime and all of those things. And so, again, looking at it from a super high level, those are things that really need to be addressed in conjunction with all of the other things that we're talking about, with the technology focus. And let's not forget, the human element of all of this, the safety and public trust of hydrogen could really be thwarted just by the very fact on the chemical nature of hydrogen. It's high diffusivity, it's low molecular weight, it's broad flammability range. All of those things challenge how hydrogen is produced, in what form, how it's stored, and all of that. And so I think there's a lot of competencies that need to be addressed and developed along the way, and those conversations need to start now.
Well, but is that a bar to getting going? I mean, in other words, we can produce low carbon hydrogen today, right now.
Yeah.
It's no problem to be produced. And the idea is, I think what you're pointing to is maybe that the benefits of it, being able to say, well, apart from the safety issues, there's always safety issues, but I think currently that's being addressed by industry fairly well. How do we quantify that? How do we give you a credit for, reducing the carbon intensity through low carbon hydrogen? How will that work? And how do we do that in a way that, where you can get a product to Japan? And in Japan, it's considered, to be decarbonizing for the Japanese economy. I mean, there's obviously a lack of standards across, but is that really going to be a bar to just doing what we can do?
No, we've already agreed with several countries like Australia, Middle East, to bring in hydrogen, but in the form of ammonia, because ammonia is probably the safer and easier carrier to bring in hydrogen. So there's really no stop, because that's the only alternative we have. America has a lot of options, but there are countries that don't. So that's why we just can't stop. We just kind of have to go at it and see what can be done about it.
Rich?
Yeah, there's analogs in Europe as well. Rotterdam has a plan to import ammonia as a vector for hydrogen from the U.S. if the U.S. can produce it. And it goes to, I think as Rachel pointed out, there's a roadmap at multiple levels. At the lowest level is what we can do now. The LNG exporters make a pretty good argument that they're decarbonizing with their core business today, because every BTU of LNG displaces a BTU of coal, wood, or dung in a developing country. But beyond that, you have a lot of emerging ideas around exporting either methanol or ammonia as fuels or as hydrogen vectors. And in fact, the infrastructure bill, which, touch wood, it will get passed, has a lot of money for investigating the future of hydrogen. And that's where Houston actually is a unique place. And it comes back to recycling assets. We can recycle the human talent as well. The skills to build the hydrogen economy are the same as the skills to build process manufacturing and so forth. And there's a call for letters of interest right now for whole communities to get together and say, we want the $1 billion. And that's not study money. That's that's hard tech money, as TAC has said. So there's a roadmap, multiple levels. The policy level is getting there, and the technology, the hard tech, the company innovations are there as well. So it's about coalescing these things, and Houston's a great place for it to happen.
And I just want to add on that. We have run simulations on how competitive the Gulf of, especially Houston, can be compared to producing hydrogen, compared to what it is in the Middle East and Australia. Houston is pretty much competitive to those countries, because what you need in hydrogen is relatively cheap renewable power. Texas does have that, right? It's got the biggest renewable operation in the whole country. But then what Texas does have, what the other countries don't have, is already an oil and gas infrastructure, a talented labor pool, skilled craftsmen to build plants, complex plants. You don't have that in Australia or in the Middle East. So when you think about the whole delivered cost of bringing in hydrogen into Japan, US isn't too bad compared to the Middle East. The Middle East might have slightly cheaper renewable power at 2 cents, but other than that, the US Gulf isn't too bad behind.
And I think it's a good point about the Gulf Coast and having it, it's a cluster of industries, cluster of assets, clusters of smart people, hardworking folks. So whether it's CO2 or hydrogen, they kind of need to be done at scale and in clusters, right? You're not going to have those one-off small projects. And so that's where you're going to see it, maybe on the West Coast where you have more incentives and strong industrial clusters there. Certainly the Gulf Coast, and we're participating in a couple different initiatives in the UK, Gigastack project, a big offshore, massive, electrolyzer, and then also the Net Humber Zero, which is a massive CO2 cluster built around that industrial area as well. So I think those things are important, but the scale, you have to think about that. The largest electrolyzer in the U.S., the amount of hydrogen it produces is 1/10 of what a average hydrogen plant in a refinery makes. Right. So the largest one in the world is 1/10 the size of an average one in a refinery.
Well, we've got to.
Sorry, Jason. If I can still just build on what Rachel was actually saying about the policy, because policy is a really important part of it. Policy and standards. So in the transportation area, the clean fuel standard has really enabled a lot of renewable fuels to enter the California market, and the emissions therefore from road transportation to decrease. But because they had a clear target, and it's open to everyone to compete. It's ethanol and biodiesel and renewable natural gas and electricity. So it's because they just put the price on carbon. And I think having these clear policies, whether it's for hydrogen, whether it's for aviation, whether it's for road transportation or steel, will drive the innovation and will create more solutions for it. So I think policy is an important part that we often overlook.
Well, we got a question from the audience about why bother moving ammonia? Why not just take natural gas and then produce hydrogen? And I think I know your answer, but why not produce hydrogen where you want it rather than transforming it here and shipping it halfway around the globe? We've already got a pretty efficient LNG system.
Well, in the US, exactly right. You have all the natural gas, you have the ability to sequester, so you can produce all the blue hydrogen you want and just put carbon capture and sequester. You have the ability. But Japan does not have any BTUs of natural gas in the country. So it has to be all imported. So there is a solution that fits for America, there's a solution that fits for other parts of the country, and there's a solution that fits for Europe as well too. So every country is different.
Yeah, I saw a CO2 carrier on your slide.
Yeah.
So you could capture the CO2 and put it on a ship and send it somewhere else?
That's a crazy idea. See, if we have, because we don't have carbon capture ability in Japan, we don't have the sequestration geology. So the idea there is to really, again, take the CO2 elsewhere. For example, to the countries that are shipping the natural gas, and ship it there and have them sequester it for us.
Well, if the idea is global emissions and trying to reduce global emissions, why not just produce, renewable or green or low carbon intensity hydrogen here, put it in the pipeline system, burn it instead of natural gas, but take the benefit in Japan and just keep burning natural gas?
Well, thank you so much for asking that question. See, that's what the Japanese utilities are hoping that will be the norm in the future. The Japanese utilities have stated goals that they want to be owners of 30 gigawatts of renewables. We don't have that capacity in Japan, so it's going to be outside of Japan. There is no international protocol right now that the renewable produced in another country, you can take credit in Japan. But when you think about it, when companies are required to report their consolidated financial reporting on a global basis, if you reduce CO2 emissions in a country, isn't there an argument that that credit should be also applied to the country of your origin? So there might be a market for international RECs. That's, I think, what we're hoping for. But even from an ESG standpoint, just from an ESG standpoint, to be able to tell your stakeholders, well, we can't do it here in our country, but we have helped America take out CO2 emissions by investing in CO2-free renewable power projects here in America. That's, I think, what we are doing. And Mitsubishi is really helping that out as well, too.
Rachel, is this what you're talking about, the absence of sort of that kind of arrangement to lower emissions anywhere they can be lowered rather than focusing on, well, we're going to look at each country looks at its own little, high-cost solution rather than looking at an overall low-cost solution?
Yeah, I mean, and I'm just, we talk about, so-called renewable energy and zero carbon, but oftentimes when we look at those emissions, it's focused on just one segment of the supply chain, whether it's just, use. You're not factoring in all the activities that happen upstream. You're not factoring in all the activities and that take place in very sensitive and fragile regimes and deficient health and safety laws and lack of environmental transparency where these things are disposed of. And so I mean, when I look at this, I look at it, from comprehensive type of variables and not just an emission standpoint and not just carbon content. Again, looking at the social factors and the environmental factors and the economics associated with that, because that's going to give you, a better overall read on, is this truly sustainable? And so you could really apply that concept to any technology, any project, and it should be. And in fact, any decarbonization strategy should really be a de facto environmental and social equity strategy, because it's going to be the frontline communities, typically the OECD countries that reap all the benefits, and so we have to figure out how do we measure, the social equity and maximize the benefits and the outcome in this, and that's kind of the missing link in a lot of these discussions are those life cycle elements.
Well, in any concept of the low carbon economy means we have to figure out a way to count carbon in a uniform way, not just here, but in other places, and carbon reduction in a uniform way, and verification of carbon reduction in a uniform way. And I think we're pretty far from that. But do you see any prospects? I mean, Heath, you're working in this all the time. Are there prospects for doing this in a uniform way?
Yeah, so we have obligations there. So we do a lot of trading as it is in that space. And so you need a much more sophisticated way to track carbon and validate these credits and make sure you're not double counting them, right? We had this problem kind of with RINs many years ago, right? Was that a legitimate RIN or not? And we have people, they'll claim credits for protecting certain forests, which were never at risk for deforestation. So if you really actually changed the world at all there, if you made any progress. And so there are a couple different independent agencies now that are out there. I think there's 2 or 3 of them they're trying to consolidate. They're going to be sort of the ones that can come out and be independent third-party trackers, verifiers, and whether it's moving into different types of digital, even the blockchain to make sure you're getting legitimate credits there. That has to evolve. And one thing you want to make sure you're not doing is just exporting your CO2 emissions to somebody else. And so I know they're looking at the part of the legislation in DC now is, is there some kind of, carbon border adjustment? And, the EU's looking at that also. We have to be really careful about that. Otherwise, you're just moving the problem around.
I think that's right. Well, we've got a question from the audience. Could the panel comment on high temperature pyrolysis, which I think has been mentioned a few times, for converting natural gas, methane to hydrogen and elemental carbon? So basically you end up, instead of SMR or ATR where you slam steam into natural gas and off goes the CO2, there's another process where you're basically capturing that CO2 and turning it into carbon black, a form of carbon black, which is much easier to handle, can be put in other products. I mean, is there a real future here?
Well, this must be a planted question from one of our employees. But yeah, we think that's an exciting technology. The methane pyrolysis, it incinerates the CO2, the natural gas at 3,500 degrees. And the output you get is really carbon black, CO2-free carbon black, and hydrogen. And the reason why it's called turquoise is because the natural resource that you're using is natural gas. That's why it's called turquoise. But the end product is CO2 free. Now, the interesting thing about this technology is that the carbon black is also CO2 free. The world demand for carbon black is about 14 million tons. It's predominantly used for the tire industry. Every tire that's produced by weight, 30% is carbon black. And it also ties into Rachel's endgame solution for materials. Tires are responsible for the second largest CO2 emission after the internal combustion engine. So the automotive OEMs are addressing the internal combustion engines with EVs or hydrogen cell cars. But every EV is going to use a CO2 emitting tire that has carbon black. And why it's a problem is the end game for tires is always incineration at the end of the day. It emits so much CO2 at the end of the day. But if you are able to use carbon-free, CO2-free carbon black, that might be a real disruptive technology. Now, so we are looking at building the world's largest facility in, of all places, Nebraska. A lot of cheap gas, a lot of cheap renewables, and that's, I think, one way to look at it, because it doesn't require a very expensive carbon capture process. It doesn't require sequestration of the CO2.
As a matter of fact, you're
can
creating
I
another
comment
product.
on that as well? Yeah, it goes back to creating a product, because you could, we wrote a paper on turquoise hydrogen and making a case for solid carbon. And I mean, you could modify the operating parameters, and there's several different methane pyrolysis processes where the output changes the output, whether it's carbon black or graphite, carbon nanotubes, needle coke, or whatever it is. And so that can be fed into different industries.
Yes.
Now of course, I mean, we're a ways away from some of those things, and so if we really want to scale this and accelerate that, you really have to find access to new markets for solid carbon. And if you can't do that, in the meantime, what are the storage options for that? I mean, you could store them in old abandoned mines. You could, biochar and the use as a soil amendment is another option, and so that opens up places like EPA Superfund sites for remediation of hazardous waste sites and all sorts of things. And so we really have to expand that whole profile of uses, but in the short term, look at potentially storage solutions for some of these things, and what are the regulations and laws associated with that, because right now a lot of those would fall into a waste category and have to be managed as such.
But Jeremy, do we need to even be doing this? Should we be going for this advanced technology and coming up with storage solutions? I mean, your approach is we can I assume fill the whole market with renewable fuels and the circular economy approach.
Well, the thing is, I think we should explore what is possible, because sorry, but there's not going to be one single solution. So we should explore those opportunities. I think if you store it back into the pure carbon state, it's probably going to be there for a while. Yeah, so, but again, we don't necessarily always need to use what's in the ground today. There might be better technologies out there. You asked about feedstock. Is there enough feedstock? And I think Keith touched on it as well. Neste uses a lot of waste and residues, used cooking oils, animal fats, etc. Now, I think it's clear that there's not an infinite amount of restaurants out there. Yeah, so at some stage, we will be reaching that limit in the United States, but then we also have to look globally, because not all waste and residues is collected yet. And then we move beyond waste and residues. I think I mentioned algae is one exciting route. There's also the cover crops that you can plant before the season and after the season on the same land, so you get more yield from the same acres. The United States has a lot of acres of farmland, and actually it's been decreasing over the last couple of years. And some of these technologies, or some of these crops, actually then produce more food. They don't only produce more oils, but they also produce more foods to address that balance. So that's kind of the first, second generation type biofuels. But then you can move on beyond that. Forestry waste. And I think the exciting thing about forestry waste is you need to put those facilities where the trees are. You can't transport the trees to the facilities. So it means that you're going to have facilities in Mississippi, in Alabama, in Georgia, all across the United States where you have trees. You can be putting those facilities and producing the fuels on a local basis. So yes, I think there's going to be routes for carbon capture and this pyrolysis approach, but there's still a lot of other feedstocks out there that can also get us to net zero if we have the right technology vendor neutral policy approach.
Well, you and Heath, as a last question, because I think we're surprisingly just have come right up against the end of our time here. But as the last question, both you and Heath mentioned plastics, and I think you may mention it as well as a potential source of fuel. You know, the recycling of plastics. How is that really possible? How soon is that going to happen?
Yeah, it's about economy of scales, right? And can you do it and be profitable? Are people willing to pay more for recycled plastic material? Are you going to pay a premium because of what you're buying is from recycled sources? That or you need policies to incent it. But we can do that today by bringing in, you take the plastics, you turn it into a pyrolysis oil. That oil goes into an FCC today, and it comes out as renewable olefins. It go back to a cracker and then go back into plastics. So the technology's there, but the scale we're talking about is maybe somewhere between 1 to 10,000 barrels a day in an FCC. The problem's much bigger than that, and so it's a scale issue again. But
And let me add to that too, because even though, so Texas has a very business-friendly environment, actually has legislation in place that is favorable to chemical recycling or advanced recycling for plastics, but there's nothing at the national level right now. In fact, I mean, most policymakers deem advanced recycling as a form of waste treatment and incineration, and that's how the facilities are being managed right now. So we need to change the permitting structure and the zoning so that they're not managed as a hazardous waste and solid waste facility, because what they're creating is a valuable feedstock that can be fed into new projects and so forth. So there's a lot of change that needs to happen at the federal level so these can be widely adopted. And I know EPA just released a request for information looking to kind of close some of those data gaps on the emissions and environmental aspects associated with advanced recycling, but it certainly holds a lot of promise. But we just really need some advancements in our policies.
Boy, what a tremendous discussion! I want to thank you all for the great discussion and the presentations, and really the interesting things all of you are doing in the decarbonization space and in circularity. And so let's give our speakers a hand. Thank you.